the Federal Reserve could always count on being able to stimulate the US economy with a quick cut to interest rates. How far do you cut interest rates beyond zero?
Yeah.
They are now at a point where they are now facing a true crisis. Because when interest rates just barely above zero, now you're talking about 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 1% above zero. Where do you go now? What are they going to do now? The Federal Reserve is searching for other ways to pump life, literally pump, that's oxygen or air, life into a US economy that is staggering about like a drunken college student. Listen to the metaphors he's using. And the Federal Reserve is trying to pump something into an economy. What is an economy? You're talking all of these things are basically concepts except a drunken college student. The rest are fictitious concepts in your mind, and people say, well, what's going on? One of the ways that the Federal Reserve can do this is through something called, now there's a new term, quantitative easing. Have you heard the term quantitative easing before? Right. Now, in essence, what happens is that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air. I was in the High Court on the 14th of August last year saying, well, the advocate accusing me of saying that I'm saying that the South African Reserve is creating money out of thin air and Nedbank. And the judge said to him, well, you're going to be in serious trouble if that's true. And he didn't refer to me. He was speaking to an advocate. Now, it's there in the open media that the Federal Reserve, by quantitative easing, does create money out of thin air. And then they go further and they start buying things like US treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and corporate debt. So that's the next step. Or the so-called crisis step, when it was in fact designed, and we'll discuss that when we deal with the last article. But many economic analysts are now warning that further rounds of quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve could end up setting off a series of events that could ultimately unleash economic hell.
And by that, they come and buy properties in South Africa, mines in South Africa with money they printed out of thin air. Take the property out of from out onder your voete uit.
Exactly. But in essence, what they do is they create a beneficial title. Because if we look again at our immovable property, because you can't move a mine. A mine is where a mine is. Now if you look at the South African law in terms of a contract of sale, it talks specifically about a seller that has an obligation to transfer an object or something, and that something is a piece of paper. Not necessarily the possession of the property that is described or described on that title. We're dealing with paper and paper only at this point in time. In fact, there are quite a few high-profile commentators who now believe that hyperinflation in the United States is absolutely inevitable. Now, goodness gracious, this has not changed since 1913. When you read the book, when you study the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, written by Edward G. Griffin, and you go and look what they did from 1910 onwards until 1913, that's exactly what they did. They warned people that that is what's going to happen unless they create a central bank. The Federal Reserve. Now they do exactly the same thing, and they're going to end up in telling you we need to cling to the IMF, the World Bank, a central, one single central bank, and nothing has changed. Because we are not awake enough to understand that they have never changed the problem, reaction, solution syndrome that they used to drill us into the ground with.
And by that we're losing our country, literally.
Correct. Unless, and I refuse to participate in that. I'm telling you now, I've drawn a line in the ground, literally on ground, said, you go no further. No further. And I end up in situations where I end up in boardrooms or in offices where I can make a contribution by just saying to you, please just wake up. Just get out of that trance, look at the things in front of you, and then you can go. Now, For those not familiar with quantitative easing, Wikipedia is a pretty good definition. So again, they always give you a white canvas for you to project your emotions on, or they have a definition that tells you something else was. Listen to what it says. The term quantitative easing describes a form of monetary policy, public policy, monetary policy, public insurance policy, monetary policy. It's all the same, it's a policy. So monetary could also be a monetary, how to keep this monetary system stable. There needs to be a monetary policy. Some underwriting somewhere, some wrapping and ending up somewhere in wherever. And incidentally used by central banks. Central banks at this point in time. The Bank of England, the South African Reserve Bank, the Bank of Indonesia, the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Bank. To increase the supply of money in an economy when the bank rate, interest rate, discount rate and or interbank interest rate are either at or close to zero. So this was something that developed up to a point where they had time to say the repo rate or the interest rate was at some stage, what was it? It was 8%, 23%, whatever the case might be. There was leeway. Now we're at a point where there's virtually no leeway anymore. We are now heading for zero. We are now heading for a critical area. Unless we understand and see what it means, something else is going to happen. Let's see what they say, what's going to happen. A central bank does this first by crediting its own account with money it has created ex nihilo, N-I-H-I-L-O, in brackets, out of nothing.
Sure.
It then purchases financial assets, including government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, and corporate bonds from banks and other financial institutions in a process referred to as open market operations. From banks. What if you are defined as a bank and they buy something from you, not necessarily even buying it from you, just taking it from you when you deposit it through their window, and they do something else with it? But is it really a good idea for a privately owned central bank to have the power to create money out of nothing and to do whatever it wants with it outside of US government control? It's happening as we speak. Of course not, but we deal with these issues in another article, which I'm not going to go into this one. What we will concern ourselves with in this article are the negative effects that could be unleashed as the Federal Reserve further abuses this power. Now they do it in your face. They tell you this is the negative consequences, but they don't change it. Because they sit and wait and they see that most people are so oblivious of what is going on that they can carry on and do exactly what they want, and when it finally crashes down, they're going to say, well, since you haven't done anything, we're going to offer you the solution.
Yes.
Now keep in mind that disasters, I must read this slowly. Now, keep in mind that disasters don't usually happen overnight. It's planned. They usually build up over time. When the Federal Reserve begins new rounds of quantitative easing, it will take time for the effects to be felt. The fact that they did a bank run on the economy or on the banks on the 11th of September 2008 is firstly unknown, secondly the implications poorly understood, and thirdly no one understands that the disaster already started there, so-called. And it wasn't a disaster, it was meant to be. It was like a trigger to set off a series of events to bring us to the point where now they say it's going to take a little longer. They always give themselves some leeway in order to do what they want to do. And so far, the new quantitative easing measures that the Federal Reserve has implemented have been relatively mild. So, when you look at the foreclosures on people living in tent houses now or in tent camps, do you regard that as mild? When the whole family is destroyed and there's foreclosure on their homes on a daily basis? Is that regarded as mild?
No, not at all. Glad nie.
Right, so we need to look at it from a different perspective. What we will concern ourselves with in this article are the negative effects that could be unleashed as the Federal Reserve further abuses its power. They have no reason not to stop, or to stop, because the agenda is somewhere else, and that's the last article that we're going to share, that we look at. And we mentioned, now keep in mind that disasters don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
It was planned.
Yeah.
And so far, the new quantitative easing measures that the Federal Reserve has implemented has been relatively mild, with continuous little points. The Federal Reserve has announced that it will continue to roll over the Federal Reserve's holding of Treasury securities as they mature. Now, when we first started our discussions, I said to you, at this point in time, we have two choices to deal with this. We either do a set-off, or we do a deferral and a rollover into the next fiscal year. Yes. Now, once you understand that, that puts a hold on everything. Then the negative effects disappear in the mist. It's not applicable at all. It doesn't affect us, because now we're going to set off. And now we take control back, the control that we have to deal with these issues. Right, so we need to look at it from a different perspective. What we will concern ourselves with in this article are the negative effects that could be unleashed as the Federal Reserve further abuses its power. They have no reason not to stop, or to stop, because the agenda is somewhere else, and that's the last article that we're going to share, that we look at. And we mentioned, now keep in mind that disasters don't happen overnight. Yeah. It was planned. Yeah. And so far, the new quantitative easing measures that the Federal Reserve has implemented has been relatively mild, with continuous little points. The Federal Reserve has announced that it will continue to roll over the Federal Reserve's holding of Treasury securities as they mature. Now, when we first started our discussions, I said to you, at this point in time, we have two choices to deal with this. We either do a set-off, or we do a deferral and a rollover into the next fiscal year. Yes. Now, once you understand that, that puts a hold on everything. Then the negative effects disappear in the mist. It's not applicable at all. It doesn't affect us, because now we're going to set off. And now we take control back, the control that we have to deal with these issues. The Federal Reserve has also announced that it's decided to reinvest principal payments on mortgage holdings into the US Treasury securities.
Sure.
So it's a recycling of the so-called capital now on principal payments back into securities. Not just now on interest payments, it's now also on the principal. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York announced on Wednesday that it will purchase $18 billion worth of US Treasury securities between now and mid-September. That means another $18 billion of a country that is so indebted that they can't even service their interest payments, want to dump another 18 billion US dollars of worthless paper into a system by the end, between now and mid-September. And you tell me that no one can recognize the possibility that there's going to be hyperinflation like there was in Zimbabwe. So is there a reason we should be concerned about all of this, as if it's not even mentionable? Well, yes, there is. McFarber, the author of the Gloom, Boom and Doom report, recently warned CNBC that all of its intervention by the Federal Reserve is going to create a final crisis that will destroy the US financial system. It's not a warning, it was designed that way. They just make it more acceptable. Investors should have listened to me already 6 months ago when I wrote that the Fed will continue to monetize. So they also don't get the message. It's a question of there's a latent apathy that is tangible. You can almost touch it with your hands. That people they just don't care until it becomes enormous proportions. Then perhaps and then sometimes it's too late. They will print and print and print until the final crisis wipes out the whole system. Now that's an illusion, and I can't wait for this whole system to disappear, because then we can recreate what is necessary and change the whole paradigm. But we need to be aware in order to do that.
Yeah.
Now, in a recent article, Bob Chapman of the International Forecaster describes some of the financial gymnastics that our financial authorities go through just to keep the current shell game going. Shell game. It's just, again, it's a pure illusion. But first, we ignore things like monthly 100 billion plus mathematical discrepancies between the amount of the government's deficit and the amount of treasury bonds being sold. So they lie continuously. There's a constant discrepancy. People say, well, there's millions disappeared from platinum. There's $2.7 trillion that disappeared in Iraq. Where did it go to? It was never there in the first place. Then we give the proceeds from the bogus excess treasury sales to foreign countries, foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds, as well as Cayman Island hedge funds, so that they can do what with? Question mark. Why? So that they can buy US treasury paper and agency paper, among other things. Yep. We set up the straw men, fund them with counterfeit money illegally created out of thin air, beyond what is needed to fund the ever-increasing deficit being created by the drunken sailors running the US government. And we then magically create categories of new mega buyers in our financial reports, mega buyers, to show everyone how our treasury paper is just as beloved as in the old days. 400 million for investment transaction or property transaction. What are we talking about? We're talking about hyperinflation. Why? Even the totally bankrupt UK has magically created $180 billion for the express purpose of buying up those treasuries to keep the whole rip-off party going. What a mess they have created. No, what a mess we have allowed them to create. Because we do not understand what's going on, and we're not prepared to get ourselves off our backsides and doing something about it. Things have gotten so bad that even CNN is publishing articles that openly acknowledge the crisis. In a recent article on CNN entitled, "Is this finally the economic collapse?" Keith R. McCulloch warned that the Federal Reserve openly buying large amounts of US government debt is a very dangerous threshold to cross. Now that the US can't cut interest rates any lower, the only option left on the table is when the Fed just announced it would start buying treasury debt. So buying treasury debt and servicing it or paying for it with paper created out of thin air. And that could lead the country to the brink of collapse. According to economists Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, whose views we share, crossing the 90% debt GDP threshold is the equivalent of crossing the proverbial Rubicon of economic growth. It's a point from which it's almost impossible to return unless you understand commercial redemption and you understand the legislation that applies to this circus. And that is the crux of the problem. The US government has a debt that is absolutely spiraling out of control. Now, you know what? South Africa is next. It's going to go the same way. In fact, we've already put it in place. The $3 billion that they dumped into so-called infrastructure for the World Cup, who's going to settle that account? Who's going to settle that debt? This is a problem that's been building for decades, and there simply is no quick fix for it. Yes, there is no quick fix, but there is a guaranteed solution if we understand how it came about. Now, but the truth is that was seen as far back as 1835. 1835.
Sure.
The Bills of Exchange Act was enacted in 1882. Our Bills of Exchange Act of 64 was amended in 2000 by Amendment Act 56. What was the implications? What started off as the 1882 Bills of Exchange, which is mentioned as probably the best legislation ever enacted in a parliament, the English Bills of Exchange Act, that applies to the Americans and to us and elsewhere in the world. What are the implications of that? What was written in that act? What is written in your Bills of Exchange Act, Act 34 of 1964, as amended by Act 56 of 2000? What is the suretyship of 1971? Now, why was that amended? And how does it affect your security interests, especially if you're a woman? Those are the questions that we need to pursue and look and get a point on.